The woods were alive. They breathed in the cold night air. Fog twisted among the trees like ghostly fingers. The moon, a pale sliver, offered no comfort. It only highlighted the darkness that clung to everything. The trees themselves were gnarled and ancient. Their branches reached out like claws, eager to snatch at anything that dared to enter. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was a smell that spoke of secrets and decay, a smell that whispered of things best left undisturbed. But even with the oppressive atmosphere, there was a strange allure to the place. It was the kind of beauty that could only be found in darkness. It was a beauty that drew you in, even as it warned you to stay away. For deep within these woods, nestled among the shadows and secrets, lay Hollow Creek Cabin. And it was to this place that Emma and Jake, a young couple seeking adventure, were headed. They had no idea what awaited them. The old Jeep lumbered down the dirt road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The night was thick, almost tangible, wrapping around the vehicle like a shroud. Inside, Emma and Jake sat in silence, their faces illuminated by the dashboard's faint glow. The hum of the engine was the only sound, a monotonous drone that filled the void between them. They had been driving for hours, the outside world fading into a distant memory. The road seemed endless, a ribbon of darkness stretching out before them, leading them deeper into the unknown. "How much farther?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her question hung in the air, a fragile thread of sound in the oppressive silence. She clutched her jacket tighter as if trying to ward off the chill that had seeped into the car. The cold was more than just physical. It was a creeping sense of dread that gnawed at her insides. The silence of the woods pressed in on them, broken only by the sound of their own breathing. Each breath seemed louder, more pronounced, as if the forest itself was listening. "Not much further now," Jake replied, his eyes glued to the road ahead. His voice was steady, but his grip on the steering wheel betrayed his tension. Just a few more miles. He tried to sound reassuring, but even he could feel the unease creeping into his voice. The darkness seemed to close in around them, a living entity that watched and waited. They had rented Hollow Creek Cabin for a weekend getaway, a chance to escape the city and reconnect with nature. The idea had seemed perfect, a serene retreat far from the hustle and bustle of their daily lives. Or at least, that's what the brochure had promised. The glossy images of a cozy cabin nestled in the woods had painted a picture of tranquility and peace. Now, surrounded by the oppressive darkness of the woods, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a terrible mistake. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Finally, the Jeep sputtered to a stop in front of a dilapidated wooden cabin. The engine's dying rumble echoed in the stillness, a final protest before silence reclaimed the night. It stood alone in a small clearing, its windows dark and lifeless. The cabin seemed to exude a sense of abandonment, as if it had been forgotten by time itself. The paint peeled from its walls like dying skin, and the porch sagged precariously to one side. It was a far cry from the idyllic retreat they had envisioned, a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving. With hesitant steps, they exited the Jeep, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound in the oppressive silence. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Jake reached out to open the cabin door, the rusty hinges creaking in protest. As the door swung open, a musty smell wafted out, a mix of mildew and neglect. They stood in the doorway, peering into the dark interior. The cabin was a shadowy void, its secrets hidden in the gloom. Emma shivered, not from the cold, but from the sense of foreboding that gripped her heart. "Well," Jake said, forcing a smile. He tried to mask his unease, but the tension in his voice was unmistakable. "This is it. Home sweet home," he added, attempting to inject some cheer into his words. But the cabin's foreboding presence made it difficult. He grabbed their bags from the back of the Jeep and headed towards the cabin, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. Each step seemed to resonate with an eerie echo, as if the forest itself was amplifying the sound. Emma followed more slowly, her eyes scanning their surroundings. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The forest seemed to press in on the clearing, the trees watching them with silent intensity. The dense foliage created an almost claustrophobic atmosphere, making the clearing feel like a small, isolated island in a sea of shadows. She could have sworn she heard whispers carried on the wind, but when she turned to face them, there was nothing there. The rustling leaves seemed to mock her, their movements too deliberate to be just the wind. The cabin's interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, trapping them in a time long forgotten. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the rafters like macabre decorations. The neglect was palpable, each layer of dust a testament to years of abandonment. A single fireplace dominated one wall, its stone hearth cold and empty. It was as if the warmth had been sucked out of the room, leaving only a chilling void. As Jake busied himself with unpacking, Emma wandered over to the fireplace, drawn by a series of strange carvings etched into the stone. The symbols seemed to call to her, their meaning just out of reach. They were crudely made, but there was a disturbing familiarity to their shapes. It was as if she had seen them before, in a dream or a nightmare. Circles within circles, spirals, and strange angular symbols that seemed to writhe before her eyes. The more she stared, the more they seemed to move, as if alive with some dark energy. "What do you make of these?" she asked, her voice tight with apprehension. She couldn't shake the feeling that these symbols held some sinister significance. She ran her fingers over the cold stone, tracing the outline of one particularly unsettling symbol. The stone felt unnaturally cold, sending a shiver down her spine. It resembled an eye, but with a pupil that spiraled endlessly inward. The more she looked, the more it seemed to draw her in, as if it were a window to another world, one filled with darkness and secrets. Jake joined her at the fireplace, peering at the carvings with a frown. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the wall, making the carvings seem almost alive. "Probably just kids messing around," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He tried to sound dismissive, but the unease in his eyes betrayed him. Trying to scare each other with ghost stories. He remembered the tales he used to hear as a child, stories of spirits and ancient curses. But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the silence was unnaturally heavy. The carvings seemed ancient, imbued with a sense of malice that sent shivers down his spine. Each line and curve told a story of darkness and despair. He reached out to touch one, but Emma pulled him back. Her grip was firm, almost desperate. "Don't!" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Her voice trembled, and Jake could see the genuine terror in her eyes. "I have a bad feeling about this place." She glanced around nervously, as if expecting something to jump out from the shadows. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance a twig snapped. The sound echoed through the cabin, amplifying their fear. Emma jumped, her heart pounding in her chest. She clutched at her chest, trying to steady her breathing. "It's just the wind," Jake said, trying to sound calm. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but his own heart was racing. But he couldn't help but notice that the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, as if something unseen was stirring in the darkness. The night deepened, and the sense of dread grew stronger. They tried to make themselves comfortable, building a fire in the old hearth and unpacking their supplies. The warmth of the fire provided little comfort against the cold fear that gripped them. But the oppressive atmosphere of the cabin weighed on them, making it impossible to relax. Every shadow seemed to hide a secret, every sound a potential threat. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind against the windows sent a jolt of fear through them. The cabin seemed to be alive, breathing and watching their every move. They were both relieved when exhaustion finally overtook them, and they drifted off to a restless sleep. But even in sleep, their dreams were haunted by the shadows that stirred in the darkness, whispering secrets of the past. Emma woke with a start. Her heart raced, and her breath came in short, shallow gasps. The fire had died down to embers, casting flickering shadows across the room. The only sound was the steady drip of water from a leak in the roof. She reached out for Jake, but her hand met only cold sheets. "Jake?" she whispered, her voice trembling. There was no answer. She sat up, her eyes scanning the darkness. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she realized with a start that the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The same smell that had permeated the woods outside. She stumbled to her feet and made her way to the living room. The room was empty, but the front door stood ajar, a sliver of moonlight cutting through the opening. "Jake!" she called out again, her voice barely a whisper. As she stepped closer to the door, she noticed something lying on the floor. It was a small wooden box, its lid slightly open. She recognized it as one of several old crates she had seen piled in a corner of the living room earlier. With trembling hands, she picked up the box and peered inside. What she saw made her blood run cold.